In 1492, Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator, embarked on a journey that would forever change the course of history. Sponsored by the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Queen Isabella, and King Ferdinand, Columbus sought a westward route to Asia, aiming to establish new trade routes for spices, silk, and other valuable commodities. What Columbus did not anticipate was that his quest for wealth and glory would lead him to a land unknown to Europeans, the New World. On October 12, 1492, after 2 months at sea, Columbus and his crew finally spotted land. According to accounts, the first sighting of land was made by a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, who cried out, "Tierra, tierra, land, land," from the Pinta, Columbus' flagship. Columbus, however, claimed that he had seen a flickering light earlier in the night, which he believed to be an indication of land. While his crew had been skeptical, Columbus felt confident that the light he had seen was a sign of land's proximity. The land they had arrived at, though not yet known to them, would later be identified as one of the islands in the Lucayan archipelago. The first island Columbus encountered, later named Guanahani by the indigenous people, was lush and covered in greenery. The islands were populated by the Taino, an indigenous group belonging to the Arawakan family, who lived across much of the Caribbean. Columbus and his crew, upon landing, were greeted by the Taino, who saw them as divine beings. The Taino people, whose lives had been shaped by their deep connection to nature, had never seen people like Columbus and his crew before. The Europeans were dressed in strange clothes, carried weapons, and arrived on unfamiliar ships, a stark contrast to the Taino's lifestyle. Columbus, in turn, regarded the Taino as gentle and naive. He described them as very handsome people who bore no arms and had no knowledge of iron. The first interactions between the Spanish and the Taino were peaceful. The indigenous people offered the Spaniards food and drink, fruits like cassava and sweet potatoes, which Columbus noted with wonder, as well as the vibrant cotton and parrots that the Taino prized. The Spaniards, in exchange, gave the Taino red hats and beads, simple items that fascinated the indigenous people. This encounter was marked by mutual curiosity and exchanges of goods, but Columbus would soon see that his mission in the Caribbean was more than just a peaceful exploration. After establishing a temporary settlement and claiming the land for Spain, Columbus embarked on a search for riches, particularly gold. He was convinced that the islands of the Caribbean could provide wealth for Spain. However, despite his optimism, Columbus found no immediate signs of gold. He continued to explore the nearby islands, searching for resources, and hoping to find what he believed would justify the immense expense of the journey and the long voyage back to Spain. During his travels, Columbus landed on Cuba, which he initially thought might be part of China or Japan, and later reached the island of Hispaniola, which would become the center of Spanish colonization in the Caribbean. By December 1492, Columbus' flagship Santa Maria ran aground on the northern coast of Hispaniola. The ship was deemed unrepairable, and the crew was forced to salvage what they could. Columbus, resourceful and resolute, decided to leave behind 39 men to establish a fort from the salvaged wood of the shipwreck. The fort, named La Navidad, was intended to serve as a base for further exploration and as a symbol of Spain's claim to the new lands. Columbus then departed for Spain, leaving the men behind with orders to continue exploring and to secure any resources they could find. Upon his return to Spain in early 1493, Columbus presented his findings to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, bringing with him various native goods such as gold, parrots, and plants. His report was persuasive, and he was granted the resources for a second voyage, with the promise of a much larger fleet minus 17 ships and hundreds of men, to explore and establish a more permanent Spanish presence in the Caribbean. Columbus' second voyage to the Caribbean, beginning in 1493, would not be as peaceful as the first. Upon his return to Hispaniola, Columbus found that La Navidad had been destroyed and all 39 of his men had been killed. The fort had been attacked by the indigenous Taino, who had grown disillusioned with the Spanish. The reasons for the Taino's anger were rooted in the actions of Columbus' men. who had violated the trust of the Taino by stealing and committing acts of violence, including the rape of indigenous women. The Spanish had initially arrived with the pretense of friendship, but their greed soon turned destructive. Columbus and his men had demanded gold from the Taino, forcing them to work in gold mines and to pay a tribute in gold and cotton. Those who refused to comply were often punished severely. According to reports, the Spanish would cut off the hands of any Taino who failed to meet the tribute demands. This cruelty led to the Taino's decision to eliminate the Spanish presence on the island, culminating in the destruction of La Navidad. Columbus, enraged by the death of his men and the destruction of the fort, retaliated swiftly. He sent an army of Spanish soldiers to destroy Taino villages and to exact retribution for the loss of his men. The Taino, however, were not passive victims in this colonial encounter. They organized and fought back against the Spanish, using their knowledge of the land to launch ambushes and attacks. One notable leader of the Taino resistance was Caonabo, a powerful chief who led the indigenous forces in battle. Despite their best efforts, the Taino were no match for the Spanish military technology, including firearms and steel weapons. The conflict between the Spanish and the Taino escalated as Columbus and his men expanded their settlements and began to impose their system of encomienda, a feudal system that granted Spanish settlers the right to extract labor and tribute from the indigenous people. The Taino were forced to work in the gold mines or in agricultural production, often under brutal conditions. Those who could not meet the Spanish demands were punished severely. The system led to widespread suffering and population decline among the Taino people. The encomienda system, which was implemented throughout the Spanish colonies in the Americas, was particularly devastating to the Taino. Under this system, Spanish settlers were granted control over groups of indigenous people, whom they could force to work in mines, fields, or households. The Taino were expected to pay tribute, often in the form of gold or cotton, in exchange for the promise of protection and conversion to Christianity. However, in practice, the encomienda system resulted in the exploitation, enslavement, and death of countless Taino people. The Taino were forced to labor under grueling conditions, and those who failed to meet the demands were often subjected to punishment. Columbus and his successors used violence to maintain control over the population. The Spanish also introduced diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the Taino had no immunity. The combination of forced labor, starvation, and disease decimated the indigenous population. It is estimated that within just a few decades, the Taino population in Hispaniola, which may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Thousands had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. The brutality of the Spanish colonizers led to open revolts and resistance from the indigenous population. The Taino leaders, such as Caonabo, fought valiantly to preserve their way of life, but they were ultimately defeated by the superior weaponry and tactics of the Spanish. Despite their efforts, the indigenous resistance was unsuccessful in the face of overwhelming Spanish forces. By 1496, it was clear that the Taino civilization was in a state of rapid decline. The survivors of the initial encounters with Columbus' men were either enslaved, murdered, or succumbed to the diseases brought by the Europeans. The Spanish continued their conquest of the Caribbean, establishing more colonies and exploiting the land and people for resources. The death toll from violence, disease, and forced labor was staggering. Estimates suggest that by the end of the 16th century, the Taino population in the Caribbean had been reduced by as much as 90%. Many Taino committed suicide to escape the horrors of Spanish rule, and entire communities were destroyed. As the population shrank, the Spanish turned to the African slave trade to replace the labor force lost through death and rebellion. Despite their tragic fate, the legacy of the Taino lives on. Modern Caribbean cultures, especially those of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, still bear traces of Taino language, customs, and traditions. The Taino were not entirely erased from history, and their story of resistance, resilience, and survival continues to inspire indigenous movements across the Americas today. The arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean in 1492 marked the beginning of a dark chapter in the history of indigenous peoples in the Americas. The encounter between the Spanish and the Taino was characterized by a mixture of curiosity, misunderstanding, and violence. While the initial interactions were marked by peaceful exchanges, the ensuing years would see the Taino subjected to exploitation, enslavement, and eventual destruction.